Good afternoon and welcome to our event, Shaping a Clean Energy Revolution. My name is Sachendra and I'm the Vice Curator of the Sydney Global Shapers community and producer of the Great Australian Reset event series. In the following hour, we have a panel discussion with some great speakers and we'll leave a few minutes towards the end of the event for some Q&A, so please feel free to send through your questions to the Q&A function on your screen. Before I proceed, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, air, water, and community. I'm dialing in from Sydney and I'm on Gadigal land, and I would like to pay my respects to these traditional custodians and their ongoing cultures, and to the elders present, past, and emerging. This event is the final part of the Great Australian Reset series, and we're running for the 2020 Spark Festival. And our hub in Sydney is part of a network of over 400 global shaper hubs across 148 countries, comprising of young leaders 30 and under, driving socially impactful initiatives in their city. We often come together from diverse backgrounds and sectors, including entrepreneurship, healthcare, engineering, and the arts, and in many cases, a combination of the above. Our community is part of the World Economic Forum, which is the international organization for public-private cooperation, which convenes world leaders through a number of platforms, including the global meeting in Davos, Switzerland, every year. So this series is a locally inspired and adapted version of the Great Reset initiative that the Forum launched early this year, alongside leaders like UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Prince Charles, in response to the political, economic, and social disruptions caused by the COVID-19 crisis. So what we're hoping to explore through these conversations and the local projects we run in Sydney is how we can best challenge and cooperate with governments and business leaders in Australia to reframe the pressures and uncertainties created by COVID-19 as an opportunity to redesign the most inequitable and unsustainable aspects of our economy. So I would now like to introduce Darcy Small, who is the Secretary of the Sydney Hub and who is also the moderator of our event this afternoon. Darcy loves clean energy, coffee, and camping, and his childhood was spent exploring the natural surrounds of his rural hometown, inspiring him to pursue a career focused on climate action. He graduated with a degree in photovoltaics and solar energy engineering and is currently researching energy resilience at the University of New South Wales, but spends most of his time working with sustainable coffee. So Darcy has co-founded KUA to help coffee drinkers take action against global inequalities and the climate crisis. Over to you, Darcy.
Thank you so much, Hash. I'm really excited for this conversation. When you gave me the opportunity, you said there were three kind of areas that I might like to touch on, being climate change, clean energy, and COVID-19. Now, I'm terrible at compromise, so I thought I'd do my best to squeeze all of those three themes into one conversation and also look at the idea of compromise as well. My goal, or our goal for this afternoon, is to have a conversation that is interesting enough to make the dinner table of the people that are watching. Why? Because I think if our conversations make it back to the dinner table, it means that our audience is equipped with sufficient knowledge to lead conversations themselves about these important topics and can then start leading change within their organizations, their peer group, workplaces, and broader society. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be an easy thing to achieve, but I think with the panelists we have, it's going to be super easy. And I'm very excited to have Jess on board. Jess is a City of Sydney Independent Councillor and Deputy Chair of the Environment Committee. I actually first met Jess when she gave a seminar at the School of Renewable Energy at UNSW and inspired me with her talk on how to get shit done. And Jess has been putting this into action with initiatives such as the Greener Spaces, Better Places program. Meanwhile, the City of Sydney is now, as of this year, 100% powered by renewable energy, something that Australia actually didn't think possible for a very long time. That is until Beyond Zero Emissions came along. Now we have Eytan Lenko, the Executive Chairperson of Beyond Zero Emissions. And back in 2010, BZE released a report that swung the conversation about renewables from is it possible to is it affordable? Now, 10 years later, in the middle of a pandemic, it looks like we've solved the economics as well. BZE has released their 1 million jobs plan, outlining how Australia can make a renewables-led recovery through 90 gigawatts of renewable energy, 2.5 million better buildings, and creating 1 million jobs in the process. Eytan is also a tech entrepreneur and an advisor to the impact investment group's Giant Leap Fund. Speaking of impact investment, I recently found out that in Australia, super owns more than 50% of the stock exchange, which represents a $2.9 trillion lever. And we're super, super lucky to have Kirstin on board as well, who's the CEO and co-founder of Future Super, which invests for a prosperous future free from climate change and inequality, or like a future that we actually want to retire into. Kirstin played a pivotal role in the corporate involvement in the September 2019 climate strike and leads her organisation with Purpose First. Kirstin describes herself as an activist in corporate clothing and Future Super as the first domino in the super industry, which is something that I'm really excited to chat about a little bit later. But to start with, I think that I've come to the realization from my readings and what's been going on in the news that despite the pandemic resulting in a lowering of carbon dioxide emissions, that's more of a symptom than a solution. And in the second part of the Great Reset series, we actually had the Human Rights Commissioner on, and he described the pandemic as a social catastrophe. And I wanted to see if we could flip the conversation and ask, unless what? Jess, is there something that the pandemic has given us to look forward to? Do we have an increased appetite for change?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting that you say an appetite for change as if we kind of had a choice. So I think what we're seeing in government in particular is that things are moving very, very quickly. And one of the things I'm most excited about is seeing how the whole process of policy making is really being challenged and flipped on its head. So something that we've been doing quite a lot recently is obviously the cycleways, and, you know, love them or hate them, doesn't really matter. I love them personally. But the thing that's really interesting about this is this whole approach, this approach of iterative design and, I guess, adaptive design of policy. And I think it's really interesting because rather than going and committing a whole lot of money up front and then figuring out maybe later down the track you might have made the wrong decision, this iterative design approach actually involves the community and seems to be working really well. So yeah, I'm excited about the opportunity that it gives us to approach systemic change really differently, and it's something that we need to get a little bit of practice doing because undoubtedly the future is going to demand a lot of that and we won't have a choice.
I am also a big fan of cycleways, and that's probably just one of the many things that we agree on. So I'm a little bit worried that on this panel here we've created an echo chamber. I mean, for me, climate change is the biggest problem, but I'm also very lucky in that I deal with it from a position of comfort and a position of privilege. And I think it's important to go back to what other issues people are experiencing at the moment, particularly with COVID. And do you have any ideas or thoughts around other injustices that we need to be sensitive to when talking about climate change and the issues that we care about?
So was that one to me?
That one was to Kirstin, whether there are other injustices we need to be sensitive to when talking about climate change.
Sorry, I missed the prompt. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as you say, we obviously, all of us care a lot about climate change and put a lot of emphasis on our work in addressing climate change in the various ways we can. But I think we also all need to acknowledge that we do come from a position of privilege, and that climate change doesn't impact on the community equally. It is people who are typically more underprivileged who will be hit worse, who are already being hit by the effects of climate change, and who are going to have the least resources to be able to deal with those effects. So in particular, people in lower socioeconomic statuses, Indigenous populations in Australia, overseas, Islander communities, I think, are really at the front line of climate change effects that are being felt today. And really, I think there can be no solution to climate change without involving those communities in the solution as well.
Yeah, I think that's such an important perspective. I mean, Spark Festival, we have an audience of innovators, an audience of entrepreneurs. So keeping that perspective front of mind when designing solutions is really pivotal. Speaking of an audience of entrepreneurs, Eytan, you have presented a report which basically lays out a path forward for Australia. And one of the best parts of it is that all of the projects in there are pretty much shovel ready. But entrepreneurs don't necessarily want the solutions. They want to know what problems they can solve from a technical perspective. Have you left anything in the climate change discussion to be solved for these entrepreneurs?
Oh yeah, look, don't worry. There's tons of stuff still to be solved. There's air flight. How we're going to fly long distances. There's how we're going to do seasonal storage. There's untold problems. But even with the bits that we generally know the solutions to, like moving our energy system, our electricity system over to renewables, there's still lots of space in there for entrepreneurs to play in areas like predicting the weather accurately, in balancing out the system, in balancing, the incredible take-up of household solar and batteries, and how we kind of integrate that with the grid in intelligent ways. I've got in my house, I'm using one of these new electricity retailers that gives you wholesale pricing for your electricity. So, the price that you pay changes every half an hour depending on the demand in the system. And there's a whole lot of really cool ways that you can then start integrating the solar and your batteries and your air conditioning and your hot water system to be able to play in that market and be a mini generator on the grid. So yeah, I'm not very worried about entrepreneurs, and it's actually been great to see the entrepreneurial community step up. You've got incubators like StartMate that now have a climate cohort that I've been a mentor on. So, the new generation of entrepreneurs, climate really is front of mind for a lot of them. And, it's the biggest problem that we have to solve, and that's what entrepreneurs love.
Yeah, I think ultimately it is super exciting to be an entrepreneur who is passionate about this space. I was cooking dinner on the weekend and listening to one of your podcasts with Osher Gunsberg. I first listened to the one about The Bachelor and then the one with you about the Million Jobs Plan. And I love the bit where you described decarbonisation as this generation's moon landing. But I've been trying to convince my housemates for years that solar panels are sexy, very unsuccessfully. And I'm wondering, how do we make decarbonisation sexy? Is it important for it to be sexy? And Jess, does this link back to the idea that you've brought up in a talk in the past about the Trojan horse of fun, or is it another issue?
Well, the Trojan horse of fun is, I guess that's a way of describing an approach whereby if you don't have to enter into a situation that causes polarity and an argument, then don't. So I guess I think there's a lot more opportunity to be able to introduce these ideas. And the greatest tragedy of our time is the way in which environmental solutions have been politicised. So I think, of course, if we can avoid the chatter and get to the point, which is let's just provide people with clean energy that is cost comparative, more efficient, then yeah, that's totally the way to get onto it. But I love also, I think I was telling you last time I was down in Victoria with my family, they're all from, Mornington Peninsula, not typically, I would say, the epicenter of inner city lefties, but I sort of looked around and I saw all the guys on their phones, and I sort of assumed that they were kind of really engaged with Supercoach or something like that. And they weren't. They were having this in-depth, really, really passionate conversation about whose panels were doing better. And I just thought, oh my God, like these are the kind of people who, you know, just a lot of the politics bothers them. They might not understand it, but what they do understand is outcomes. And if you present it and communicate it in a way that resonates with them, you know, staunchest advocates of solar power ever. So that's what I kind of mean by, you know, if we can shove these big, heavy issues into a Trojan horse of fun, then I guess that's a way of leapfrogging the politics and the waste of time that often comes with the political debate. And I think Australians are really ready for that. Like, we're a can-do bunch of people, and Sparkfest sort of epitomises that for me. Like, everybody is so keen to just get on with the work, and here we are.
Here we are. Yeah, I love the idea of gamifying. Gamifying is such a cool way to bring people into technologies that they might otherwise be unfamiliar with. But one of the issues for me with things becoming politicized is I no longer know what's right and what's wrong and which technology we should support and which one we shouldn't. I mean, there are ideas around mining, gas, carbon capture, recycling, and I still don't know whether these are must-haves. So, Eytan, can you please burst my idealist bubble and tell me where Australia's future sits on a spectrum of where we are now to a perfectly sustainable, circular, zero emissions economy?
Yeah, right. That's a small question.
Yes.
I was about, before I do, just a very quick answer on the fun question that you asked Jess. I think it's really interesting now, and I'll tie this in, but you know, from a lot of people have been turned off about thinking about climate and climate solutions because so often it's been framed around our personal responsibility and how we have to do less, you know, fly less or drive less or eat less, or, you know, it's just been framed in a very negative way. And, you know, to get to your question now, the future that we're actually moving towards in Australia, a country that has probably the best renewable resource in the world, is really a future of abundance. I mean, if you can picture a future where we have basically unlimited, really low-cost energy, we can do amazing things with that you can't even imagine today. So, you know, a good example, Beyond Zero Emissions did a report last year for the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory has some of the most expensive energy in Australia. Like, to do anything, you've got to truck diesel around or build a gas pipeline. It's really expensive. But with solar, and the Northern Territory has the best solar resource basically in the world, you now have access to the world's cheapest form of energy. So by building lots of solar out in the Northern Territory and distributing that around, it means you can do things that you could never do before because suddenly you have access to cheap energy. So things like mineral processing, so we're not just digging stuff up and sending it overseas, we can actually process it here in Australia, which creates jobs, which brings a lot of benefit to the economy, and, you know, means that we actually are a smart country because we're doing more than just digging stuff up. If you think about that world where we're going to, where other countries, particularly a lot of our neighbours in Asia, don't have access to that resource the way that we do, you know, the opportunity for Australia is to really be the place where we naturally get to do those energy intensive activities because we've got access to the cheap energy. So we can export energy through hydrogen, obviously, through direct cables, like crazy projects like Sun Cable in the Northern Territory that want to export, you know, directly electricity to Asia, but also just through our products by having cheap energy, by manufacturing things here in Australia. Actually, in the products that we're manufacturing, you're embodied, you know, with the embodied energy to create those products, you're putting renewable energy in them. So you can export renewable energy through the things that we create here as well. So, you know, I won't get to, you know, obviously we're in a system at the moment that has some gas, that has this and has that. But, you know, BZE, you can go and look at our plans. Even 10 years ago, we showed pathways to how we can have a 100% renewable grid. I mean, with the technology today is all that we really need. It's just about deployment and getting it done.
Yeah, one of the cool things about BZE is that word beyond. So we're going beyond zero emissions. And my understanding is, or a lot of the talk is, can Australia get to 100% renewables? But in theory, like, can we get to 200% or 300%? And what does that mean?
Well, actually, our BZE's target, and I think it's becoming a pretty accepted target, is 700% because, yeah, there's the 100% for the existing electricity system. But then you've got to think about the solution to climate change is basically electrify everything and then power it all with renewables. So you electrify our transport system, that needs more renewables. You electrify our industry, that needs more renewables. And then we start talking about these export opportunities like hydrogen, like directly exporting renewables, and you pretty quickly get to 700%. But the cool thing is that, like, when you map out on Australia, the amount of land we would need to create 700% renewables, like, it's one of these tiny, you've seen those maps, like it's a tiny little square that you can barely kind of see. So, that's the opportunity for us. We should be powering the rest of the world.
I think you've done a very good job just there of answering my first question as well around how we make decarbonisation sexy, because I get excited about that, but I'm a bit of an engineering nerd. To take it back a little bit, your plan also has the potential to boost private sector investment by nearly 2% of GDP. I mean, many of the proposals that you've put forward do make economic sense. But Kirstin, from your perspective, what's Australia's main barrier to low carbon investment from the private sector? Is it a political, economic, technical, or psychological issue?
Look, I think it's probably all of the above. We have a real sense of sort of status quo and inertia in Australia when it comes to the way we invest. And I think you can definitely see that in the superannuation space, where there's just this kind of received wisdom that you have to invest in fossil fuels in Australia if you're going to make money. But more and more, we're just seeing that that's not true. I think particularly the last the whole of 2020 pretty much with coronavirus and the impacts on the market, what we've actually seen is a rise in the fortunes of superannuation funds and investors who are using ethical screening to govern their investments. Just as a very exciting, very recent example for us, we've just gotten the results from through to the end of September, and Future Super's investment options came number 1, 2, and 3 out of all balanced options in Australia. And previously, I don't know that any other single fund has gotten 1, 2, and 3, but this is actually the second time this year that we've gotten it as well. And the reasons for that are because of ethics. We don't invest in fossil fuels or service providers to fossil fuels. They've taken a big hit with the coronavirus crisis. We don't invest in airlines because they're so high polluting. Obviously, no one's traveling at the moment and airline profits are sort of going through the floor. We don't invest in alcohol, tobacco, gaming. The events industry obviously is being punished right now as well and having a flow-on effect to those kind of those parts of the industry. And so the ethical investment is actually coming into its own. And I think what it does show to other investors is you don't have to follow the rules that we've all been told exist. You don't have to invest in fossil fuels in order to create positive returns for your members and for your investors. There is a new way of investing, and actually in a world where this type of volatility is going to keep on happening, that new way of investing is actually a sustainable investment approach, not just in terms of the environmental impact, but in terms of the returns, the actual financial returns as well.
Jess, so that's, I guess, the finance and the investment perspective. Does it resonate with your experiences in local government and implementation of projects maybe more at a community level?
Yeah, the City of Sydney, I think more than 600 municipalities in the world have declared a climate emergency. So what that really does is reframes the expectations of the community. So every decision that we make needs to bear that in mind, that we are responding to a climate emergency, and that that's really important when we're thinking about how governments and how local government in particular invests its funds. So the City of Sydney has got a divestment strategy, but to Kirstin's point, it's really now at an interesting time because the choices that we have on investment are often determined by other levels of government and what they conceive as being safe. And, to Kirstin's point, that has totally been flipped on its head in terms of what now constitutes a AAA fund. And what's also emerging among local government is also this concept of climate risk exposure and to what extent our decisions are putting people at risk. So one of the biggest levers that we have is obviously approving or rejecting development. Now, if we know that a development is going to happen in a place or a part of the city that's either has high risk exposure to flood, or in regional councils, fire, and we say it's okay to build there, it raises some really interesting questions about responsibility, and plausible deniability is no longer an option because all of this mapping has been done. So I'm really interested in where broadly speaking, how the carbon finance disclosure project is working out, and how and if that may apply to government at some point. But in terms of a kind of very tangible outcome at the moment, we're getting some great outcomes through procurement and deciding that instead of, say, opting to make our renewable energy purchase through an Origin Energy or a company that kind of has it both ways, we're deciding to go straight to community renewable energy projects. And the reality is it's a lot cheaper too. So why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah. Eytan, I imagine you keep a relatively close eye on what planning is going on at the federal government level. Are there many big differences between the plan that you've kind of laid out with Beyond Zero Emissions and the path that we seem to be taking as a country?
Well, the federal government's obviously a big player in all of this, and one of the purposes of the Million Jobs Plan was really to take to federal government a plan that's at the scale of what Australia needs in order to recover from the economic crisis that we're in. So, look, the federal government, we had a budget announced recently. There were a few good things in it. Obviously, ARENA got refunded, although there's mandate changes there where there's some issues. There's some money for things like electric vehicle infrastructure and building retrofits, but it's all reasonably small scale compared to the initiatives that we're talking about. There is a modernising manufacturing initiative that we'll be kind of engaging with, and clean manufacturing is one of the pillars of that. So, there's some, I think the government has definitely moved, and there's a sense that they're kind of starting to understand the opportunities in this place. And, we'll obviously work to kind of continue to encourage them to understand that this is where the big opportunity is for Australia. But definitely if you compare Australia to other countries in the world, if you look at, the EU, the vast majority of their economic stimulus plan is going to clean economic initiatives. We've had South Korea similarly, in America, well, let's see what happens with the elections in America. But obviously Joe Biden has an extremely ambitious $2 trillion plan. And he's out there, just the debate half an hour ago, he said again that, when he hears climate change, he thinks of jobs. He sees that as a big opportunity, which I think is a winning message. And you talked earlier about making it sexy, but I think, there are people in the community. There are a lot of people that are concerned about climate change, but, you have this, where is it in your priority of concern? And there's a lot of people out there where their jobs and their family and putting food on the table is a higher immediate need than worrying about something that might seem more abstract like climate. So what's amazing about the fact that we're now at this point where the economics do stack up for these things, and great that Kirstin's talking about, the super returns. Jess is talking about that it's cheaper, for the city of Sydney to buy this kind of stuff. Like, the economics clearly stack up. So it's the perfect opportunity now to actually marry action on climate with economic opportunity, which then brings a whole lot more people into the fold.
Yeah, and that comes straight back to the very start of the conversation. We're in a pandemic that requires us to build new jobs, that requires us to think about how we're going to recover. And it seems like all of these things are kind of coming together to offer a pretty nice solution. We're about halfway in at the moment, and I'm sure there's lots of people with much smarter questions than I'm able to bring to the table. So I'm going to leave 15 minutes at the end. If you are listening, please use that chat function to ask a question to any of our panelists, and we'll leave time at the end to get to those. In terms of, so we've talked a lot about policy and technology, and we can go as organizations, but as individuals, one of the things that I thought about when the pandemic came about and there was social distancing requirements was some of those amazing school strikes that were really gaining momentum were suddenly not allowed. And I know, Kirstin, you and Future played a really pivotal role in the corporate involvement for strikes back in. And Jess, if I remember correctly, we're also no stranger to nonviolent direct action. We did, I think it was a talk you gave at UNSW where you mentioned that you shut down the Newcastle coal ports for a few days. What protests come into play? What role do they have? And how should people change the way they do nonviolent right now?
Oh, Kirstin, do you want to go for that one?
I'll have the first crack, and then you can come into it. I mean, I think I think there's a hugely important role for protest, and I think there's a hugely important role for protest of all types as well. I think there's a big role for ordinary, everyday people showing up in numbers and making a statement. I think there's a role for more radical protest that does cause disruption to make a statement as well. With the support that we provided 12 months ago, and I mean, we would have done it again this year, but obviously COVID sort of put a bit of a challenge on people being able to gather en masse just a month ago. But Future Super led a coalition of businesses called Not Business as Usual, and the student strike for climate was happening on a Friday. And what we did was all banded together and told our staff, you know what, if you want to go along, there's no penalties. Some businesses, I mean, we sort of did this with our business. We actually shut down for the day so that people could not only participate in the strikes, but make their placards and bring their kids along if they had children as well. So we all met together, we attended the strikes together, and we thought we'd get sort of maybe 15, 20 other businesses jump on board. We thought maybe with 20 people we might get an article about it. We ended up with over 3,000 businesses, and around 150,000 workers were able to attend those strikes because of the support of the business community. And the thing that I think is so interesting about it in Australia is so often with a Liberal government, business is used as an excuse for inaction on climate, as though, we can't upset the economy by doing anything to change the status quo. But this was a real opportunity for businesses in Australia, from, single person operations through to multi-thousand operations, to say, you know what, we don't want to be your excuse any longer. We are business leaders, but we're also members of the community, and we also have families, and we care about what the environment's going to be like for our children when they're older. Not only that, from a purely mercenary perspective, business thrives in a stable environment, not one where, there's massive disruption from bushfires and then a couple of months later, massive disruption from pandemic. So it's in our business interest as well as our personal interest to act on climate and to provide, strong action. And as we've heard from Eytan, there's also an economic opportunity that at the moment we're just really missing out on in Australia.
Yes,
that was a really yeah. I think it's bang on, and like my day job with Republic of Everyone, our whole agency attended. We're a B Corp, so that's just sort of that's the way we roll. But I guess in terms of what is the role of protest, and I think reflecting back to that time, and that was sort of circa 2000 and maybe 2007, 2009. I remember sitting around with everybody, and we felt that shutting down the Newcastle coal port as part of climate camp was really the only avenue that was left available to us. We'd written polite letters, we'd tried at that time to engage with business, and they just weren't interested. So I think the purpose of protest changes over time, but in protesting, what you're doing is you're progressing an agenda, and you're challenging people to think about things in different ways. And I had this conversation with a colleague at climate camp at the time, and we used to sort of have play this game of fantasy front pages, which is, imagine if we were on the front page of what paper and what would it say. And I remember flippantly saying, oh, imagine if climate change was front page of Vogue, and in the sports section of a Murdoch press newspaper. And at the time in 2007, that seemed like such a distant possibility. Yet, you know, like I just nearly cried when I saw, you know, not that long ago that yes, in fact, there was a whole issue of Vogue dedicated to climate change, and David Pocock was written up as an absolute hero in the Australian, and not just in the Australian, but in the sports column. I mean, I think that's how far we've come, and that's how far the narrative has progressed, and that would not be possible and would never happen were it not for, you know, brave, generally young people at the forefront agitating and pushing for that change. So that is the role that protest has always and will forever, I hope, play across a whole range of issues.
I have another newspaper example to add to that list, which is after the climate protests last year, the Financial Review had a half-page piece on the Saturday paper about how the business community had doubled the attendances at the student strikes.
Amazing, like A+.
Yeah. I remember in our workplace, we saw Future Supers lead and then decided to, I mean, we're a small workplace, but it was a really kind of big moment for us to just say, okay, no one's going to work and everyone's doing this. And it just showed what the whole purpose of us working in this organization is about. And Kirstin, that probably links back to, I think when I asked you to join the panel, you said that you described Future Super as the first domino. What does this mean, and how can businesses lead change within their own industries?
It's such a great question. I think for us, sort of very narrowly, a lot of what we do is, you know, it's kind of like we're challenging those that received wisdom, the status quo, you know, the idea that you can't have a balanced portfolio in Australia that doesn't include fossil fuels. Well, and we'll show you. You know, you can't provide sustainable returns without investing in fossil fuels. Well, you can, and we'll show you. And I should probably say past performance, not a reliable indicator of future performance. But, you know, and so all of what we do is about going out and taking these ideas that are just accepted and proving that it doesn't have to be that way. And, you know, part of the theory of change that we have is the more successful we are at running a really great superannuation fund that doesn't make profit at the expense of people or the planet, the less of an excuse the rest of the industry has. And not only that, we quite actively make available our methodologies. We fully publish all of the companies that we invest into. And part of that is, you know, I would love it if Australians Future Super's investment philosophy. I would love it if they reached out and said, hey, you know, we're thinking about divesting our portfolio from fossil fuels. Can we pick your brains about how to do it? And so within the superannuation industry, as you said before, $2.9 trillion sitting there. It's owned by individual Australians. The decisions that we make collectively can have a huge impact there. And, you know, that money could fully fund the transition to renewables more than 10 times over. And so the more we can get Australians to wake up to that fact, to move their superannuation, the more the other funds also notice those members flowing out the door, notice the funds leaving their funds, notice the revenue declining. And so that makes them sit up and take notice as well. So we really do see ourselves as hopefully the first domino, and with more big super funds and investors following, the more money we have going into renewables and away from fossil fuels.
That's such an amazing answer. I mean, we have the CEO of a super fund saying to competitors, please come and collaborate, come and work out the way that you can actually use your business to do better for climate and for other issues. It probably links, so we have in the title of this chat, the Great Australian Reset. And I mean, it's easy for someone with long hair that runs a coffee social enterprise to say that we should flip the system and start measuring well-being instead of GDP. But Eytan, is that realistic, or should we work with what we've got?
Well, I mean, I'm pretty concerned about the timescale that we've got ahead of us. And, you know, often you hear about, you know, the solution to climate change is to, you know, end capitalism and build a completely new system. But, you know, I don't know how long that takes to do, but, you know, I feel like we need to move pretty quickly. So we're kind of stuck with what we've got. And, you know, we're going to have to do that human thing where it's never perfect and we're kind of making up stuff as we go kind of thing. to get to the other side. So, ideally, the more that we can do that's making the world a better place as we're making this change, and change often brings opportunities to do things differently, then we should do that. But, I don't think we should wait to change until we've got the system in a perfect place before we even get going. Like, we just have to move now with what we've got.
Yeah. And we have the technology to make it work. So.
And so, the work that Future Super does, and all of the work that lawyers are doing, the work, there's a lot of levers that we can pull in the system that we have now, like directors' duties, the financial system, investors' appetite for actually making profit, and things like that. They're all levers that we can pull to make things go really fast. And actually saying to all of those, to capital and people who actually have the money and are kind of in control of the system that we have, that we don't like the way that you operate, and we don't want you to be part of this change, means that we're kind of, we're kind of, tying our hands behind our back before we even started. So, we've got to find ways. That's the whole policy question. How do we incentivize the behaviours in the system that we have to get to where we need to go?
Yeah, I have time for one more question, and I have my phone here, and you can see that it's a message from my friend called Maddie. And I'm going to read out a part of that message because I didn't know how to answer her question, but maybe you guys can. And she said, I was thinking about our conversation the other day, and I know I said Indigenous rights and land reclamation is my top priority. But I don't know, I definitely am really worried about climate change, reducing fossil fuel emissions. Just funny that I studied marine biology, but now I'm like super interested and passionate about sustainable energy. I just don't have any of the knowledge to do anything with it. And I feel like surrounding myself with graduates and young people that are now at the convergence of COVID and climate change and coming out into the world. I mean, Eytan, you have 1 million jobs lined up, but I don't feel they're quite right for my friend Maddie. For people who are feeling disenchanted about their career options due to climate change, does anyone have any advice?
Well, it's a good opportunity. I happen to have this book next to me that was written exactly for this purpose. It's called Facing the Climate Emergency, and it's by Margaret Klein-Salomon, who's actually a clinical psychologist, based in America, that runs an organisation called the Climate Mobilisation, which is one of the instigators of the Climate Emergency Declaration movement that the City of Sydney has joined. And that book takes you through, it's like a 7-step, one of those, self-help style books that takes you through the 7 steps of how you think about, the skills that you have and what you want to contribute. Because really, you can't give a straight answer to that question. It's different for everyone. It's like choosing a career. It is choosing a career. So, you really need kind of career guidance and to kind of like understand what you want to do. Like the way that Margaret puts it is like, imagine that everything you've done up to this point in time is kind of set you up for, the climate warrior that you want to be. So you need to kind of, apply what you've done with what you want to do and find that bridge, how to get there, which sounds trite, but I think, that's probably what all of us on this call have done. Like I didn't go into I studied engineering and science. I didn't have, climate change wasn't really on my agenda when I came out of university and started my career. And I'm reasonably confident that's the case for Kirstin and Jess, but I might be wrong on that. So, you've got to find your own way.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And to your point, before joining Future Super, I was a lawyer and a management consultant for 10 years and, working for big corporates, helping them make more money. But what I also found in those roles was that there's heaps of opportunity to put your skills to work for community benefit and social benefit, both within those structures, in volunteering work that you can do on the side. And then ultimately, when I made the jump across to Future Super, I was able to deploy them in a way that there's no way I could do my job as well as I can today if I hadn't had that experience. I think particularly for younger people, if you're, not in the decision-making levels of your organisation, if you're entry level or first couple of years of your career, don't underestimate how much power you still have to influence the people who do make decisions. You read a lot about how companies have trouble keeping millennials. That's a real thing. And if you ask for change within your organisation, you ask for permission to attend protests, you ask them to put keep cups, replace their light bulbs, all those kinds of things can show the leaders in your business how important climate is to you and can ultimately drive change at an organisational level and change the way they think about their involvement as well. So it doesn't have to be one big jump right away in your career. You can still have an impact wherever you are.
Yeah, I heard you in a podcast kind of challenging young people to make their managers say no and to really challenge them on the purpose of the organisation, at least how it's written down. And I thought that was a great sentiment as well. Jess, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's like there's a lot of pressure, especially for young people. And I think that one of the most, and also like a lot of just sad feelings. I think this stuff is really hard. And I mean, one of the things that I kind of have learnt over like a long period of time is like nobody really knows what they're doing. So it doesn't, and there's no clear path. Like it's just everybody's making it up. Anyone who says otherwise is fibbing. But I think it pays a lot to really invest in your immediate community and just try some stuff. I think one of the things that I continue to get a lot of, out of is like gardening, because it gives me a sense of connection. It gives me, it's empowering to see something that's ugly and, not working be transformed over time. So I think it's that beautiful quote is just, start where you are, use what you have and do what you can, is something that takes a bit of the pressure off, but also reminds us that we're enough in all this stuff. And sometimes just doing small things with your neighbour, gardening the verge or planting a tree, is significant, because it reminds you and I guess emboldens you the next time another opportunity comes up, that you might be able to hustle just a little bit harder.
Amazing. Well, that's the panel section of this talk over. I hope that the audience has had some questions sparked. If you do, keep sending them through, but I'm going to pass across to my fellow Global Shaper, Will, who will be selecting some of them and asking the panelists. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Darcy, and to all the panelists. It's been fantastic hearing your insights in terms of this revolution that we can be starting on. Specifically, Kirstin, your involvement really touched my participation with my company for the climate strikes last year. In fact, we ended up organising poster sign writing workshop in the office, and we had all the paints out so that everyone can be a bit creative and witty with their slogans in preparation for that climate strike that we were involved in. We have here some questions from our live audience that I'd like to present to the panel. First up, with the City of Sydney this year being one of 2 councils in Australia to switch over to renewable energies for their operations. We've got a question here for Councillor Jess from Sam. He's asking, would the City of Sydney be willing to look at Australian-sourced batteries for grid-scale storage projects?
Well, I mean, I can't answer on behalf of the whole entire council, but already we've purchased a couple of Tesla battery storage units for our depots. So that's a start. But I think it's really interesting and important and worth understanding how different levels of government are able to influence different outcomes. So yeah, totally. If it was up to the City of Sydney to convert all of the poles and wires in our LGA to storage, we would 100%, we would have done it yesterday if that was an option. However, we're part of this very complex energy system, and we're regulated by a whole range of very complex and quite, important but confusing levels of government who really do determine what we can and can't do. So IPART is probably kind of on my hit list in particular. But yeah, if the capacity was there, then totally. But in lieu of that, we have to play with what we have, which are planning instruments. So one of the things that we can and have been doing is improving environmental performance of buildings, and we also engage with commercial property owners as part of the Better Building Partnership. And that way we've engaged probably 30 of the biggest landowners in the City of Sydney to take on a whole range of energy efficiency and renewable energy initiatives. And not only have they cut their CO2 emissions by an extraordinary amount, but they've saved a hell of a lot of money. So different levels of government can play really different roles. So I think that's worth knowing, because the target, it shifts the target. And so there's a lot of pressure you can put on your council locally, particularly through procurement and planning controls. But when it comes to those large-scale interconnected grid storage, battery, full-on things, that's a conversation that has to happen at a state government level, and one that the City of Sydney is starting to have with our surrounding councils. So really kind of picking up on that idea of having collective impact. And it's a lot harder to say no to, a collective of maybe 20 councils that might represent 5 million people than it is to say no to one.
Let's now move on from the local level to a more global level. This is a question from Janaki to all the panelists we have today. She says, fossil fuels and related value-add enterprises generate valuable export earnings. How do we balance the economic benefit of this with the environmental friendly options?
I mean, I'm
Eytan,
happy to
this
have a
feels
go.
like one that you, yeah,
Sure.
go for it.
Eytan, go for it.
I mean, what's interesting about, that debate, sort of, there's an assumption there, an implicit assumption that fossil fuels are going to be an opportunity for Australia to export forever. And we know that's not the case. I mean, the whole world has signed up to net zero by 2050, and China's just signed up to net zero by 2060. So almost the whole world's kind of around that time. And, those commitments only kind of come down. Like the UK banned the sale of internal combustion vehicles by 2035, and now they've just brought it to 2030. We've just seen China, putting restrictions on the import of Australian coal. So, if Australia was, the analogy I like to make was, if Australia was the world's biggest typewriter exporter, and we heard about this computer invention that had just been, was becoming more popular, would we go down hard? I mean, would we, avoid computers because we want to protect the typewriter industry? I mean, the fact is that fossil fuels is an increasingly obsolete technology. So, rather than thinking that as an opportunity for Australia that we're missing by moving out of fossil fuels, it's actually a massive risk to be the world's number one and number two exporters of coal and gas, which are, going to be rapidly shrinking markets. That's not a position you want to be in as a business or as a country. So while we've got the time, we need to really quickly work on alternatives, because we can be in control of our economy and come up with alternatives and build a new export industry, or we can just be, victims and just ride fossil fuels out, with our economy.
Thanks, Eytan. It's great that you mentioned the risks involved, and I know, Kirstin, you also talked about looking into the future rather than in the past, and based on performance and those type of risks. We do have a question here from Michelle, and she asks, how do you get the private sector investors comfortable around the risks associated with network constraints and market price volatility?
Good question. I might just sort of broaden that one out a little bit rather than addressing the specifics, because I think the answer to private sector investment, there's two elements of it. One is looking at the data and looking at the data objectively. So, there's research published year after year which shows that a portfolio of investments that has strong ESG screening, so environmental, social and governance screening, outperforms the benchmark over the long term. And in the face of that data, year after year after year, it's amazing that investors ignore it. That's what sort of really blows my mind, is that you've got this environment where the received wisdom of we have to invest in fossil fuels, it's the only way to support the economy, it's the only way to deliver power, overrides people's logic, and it overrides what the data is saying. And I think the same thing can be true for, you know, any element of the challenges of moving over to a renewable energy system, which is, yeah, there are going to be problems, there are going to be questions we have to solve, but see the challenge in that rather than seeing, you know, the barrier. And I think more and more people are starting to do that. As you flagged, it's a great field for entrepreneurs because we just love cracking open difficult problems that people say can't be done. And so, you know, investors can either jump on board with these opportunities or get left behind.
Absolutely, and that's why we're here at SparkFest, to really, you know, take action and, you know, for us to really look forward to those challenges and see them as opportunities. Another question also from Michelle is, how do you incentivize investments in storage technologies to alleviate reliability issues associated with intermittent renewable sources? Did anyone want to tackle this one?
I think you have to legislate for it. Honestly, I don't expect that. I don't think we have time to stuff around with incentive schemes. If we are genuinely serious about reimagining and investing in a new energy production and, most importantly, distribution and storage system in Australia, it has to be legislated for. You've got to make rules like you can't have a new urban renewal precinct without that kind of capacity, or you can't build a road without that kind of capacity. So it's got to be embedded within and made a priority, I think, by organisations like Infrastructure Australia. And we probably need to start thinking, or not even, you've got to stop thinking about it. We have to start legislating for it now, even though these types of things are going to happen into the future. The same goes for, you know, better management of water infrastructure, waste infrastructure, the whole gamut. It's so much more expensive and difficult to retrofit these types of things than to embed it into the forward planning.
Thanks, Jess.
Yeah.
And finally, final question from Nathan. Do you have any environmental concerns relating to setting up solar farms or other renewable energy plants in Australia?
Well, okay, Kirstin.
You go.
No,
I was just going to say, yeah, I don't have any reasons that would be barriers as of now. The question around waste and disposal of solar cells beyond their lifetime, I think, is one that we are going to have to address, but also it's one that I back us to find a solution for. But Eytan, you probably got a better answer than I do.
No, I was going to say that. I mean, we've done a plan recently for Collie in Western Australia, and one of the industries we were suggesting for that region is solar panel recycling, because we are going to have this wave. You know, we've got a bit of time. A solar panel lifetime is 25 years. And, you know, we only started seriously putting solar panels on buildings in Australia probably 12 years ago. So we've got a little bit of time to work it out, but it is going to be definitely in the next 10, 20 years a big issue. We're going to have millions and millions of panels that are coming off people's roofs. But like Kirstin, I back us to find a solution for that, because, you know, I think solar panels are probably one of the easier things to recycle in the scheme of things.
Yeah, we've got 10 years to find a problem for that one.
Any final remarks regarding solar panels and the environmental impacts?
No.
I just, you know, I mean, again, when you hear people talking about this as well, it's like, well, go have a look at an open-cut coal mine, go to the Latrobe Valley, you know, that's the alternative where we're getting our energy from.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'll hand it over back to Hash, who's our Vice Curator for the Sydney Global Shapers Hub, who will have the concluding remarks.
Hash, I don't think we can hear you at the moment.
Ash, we can't hear you.
Oh, whoops, the wonders of mute. So thank you so much to Jess, Kirstin, and Eytan for joining the conversation today. And there was a lot to cover within an hour, but there were some fantastic insights. And a shout out to Darcy and Will as well for doing such a great job with moderating and leading the Q&A. To everyone who is joining us today, we hope these conversations have provided you with a bit of inspiration and even a booster to continue your climate journey today. If you'd like to stay across more Shaper events or are keen to get involved with our community, please follow us and reach out via our LinkedIn page, The Global Shaper Sydney. I'm a little sad because there are only 2 events left for this afternoon before the Spark Festival wraps up for 2020. So please make sure you stay tuned on this channel to catch those. But for now, here's us signing out. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good afternoon, everyone.